Hi everybody, this is Andy Bochman from the Department of Energy's Idaho National Lab, and thanks for tuning in to this address. I will try to make it worth your while, that's for sure. Coming from a Department of Energy point of view, you may wonder, well, how relevant is this for me in the USDA? And I will attempt to make the case that it's extremely relevant because all I'm going to be talking about is critical infrastructure. The energy, the water, the communications and transportation sectors and subsectors that basically make everything go, especially as everything in the world is quickly, if it hasn't already, become a computer. Another side note before I dive into the slides is that many moons ago, when I used to live in Boston, I was in a Boston-based cybersecurity startup, and we brought an application security tool and technology to USDA. That was one of my first experiences of the organization, being in the big building, walking around there, and learning that there were so many different USDAs. Anyway, we had a chance to speak frequently with then CIO Chris Smith. And I don't know if you've been around long enough to remember Chris. I think he departed a few years after our contact with him in the early 2000s. But he was just a great guy, high integrity. This is my experience of him. High integrity, really knew his technical chops. And back then, cybersecurity was a very different matter. It really was in its infancy, both the understanding of the risk and the evolving understanding of what you could do about it. And since then, so much has changed, both on the threat side and on the defensive capabilities and approaches side. Nevertheless, just wanted you to know that that early point of contact was a good one, and I feel lucky to be back with USDA, touching base again today in 2022. All right, without further ado, let's go to a full screen view and I'll take you through the talk for today. All right, the organizing principle will be basing our activities on consequence. Another way of saying it is what do we understand might happen if we were to do nothing in the cyber domain. Would argue that we can't protect everything, not when there's millions and potentially billions of endpoints that are all interconnected by technology networking means. That the only way to do this from a risk management point of view, to not go crazy, is to prioritize based on what matters most, the things that your mission cannot possibly stand to lose, and then proceed from there. Take care of those things, bring them into a better security posture, and then move to the next level down of the second most important things. That's the way we do things at the Idaho National Lab. That's the way increasingly our other lab colleagues and some of the folks we touch in industry are seeing the world. So that's what I'm talking about today, these consequence-based approaches, a few other things that are related to them, and I hope you find it worth your while. Sometimes debate whether it's necessary to have an outline to let people know sort of what's coming and in what order, or to not do that. Today, obviously, the have an outline side of the argument prevailed, and so I just want to, maybe it's because of the acronym heavy part, I want to expose you to it early and get it out of the way. CCE is the methodology that we published a book on last year. It stands for Consequence-Driven Cyber-Informed Engineering. There's that word consequence at the lead again, and engineering at the back end to say we're going to try to solve some of these problems in a different way than just, say, going to the RSA convention every year and seeing what's the latest thing in the exhibition hall, your quantum, crypto, blockchain, cyber firewall. This is a different approach than that. And so I'll also take you into a parent methodology that's related, but I'll try to explain how they're similar and yet different in cyber-informed engineering. Then we'll finish with Citrix and Cymani. I've got the climate resilience down as the closing word, but I think actually what I'm going to do is layer it in as we go through the talk and not necessarily harp on it at the end. I think I'll have said what I need to say by the time we get to the end of the presentation. All right, so I'm going to move myself around a little bit so you can see what I'm trying to get across here. This is the last background slide just to show you where I'm coming from with starting off in the Air Force, moving through several organizations. The startup that I mentioned isn't in here, but eventually got consumed by IBM. That's how I got there. And the last two logos up in the upper right, those are my two affiliations today, Idaho National Lab and the Atlantic Council. That's a think tank based in DC. Down below, you can see some of the publications that I've written since being in INL, all the way from a Harvard Business Review article in 2018 that introduced CCE, taking you through some other documents that you can see the blending, as I'm suggesting up top here, the blending of going from just being a pure cyber person looking at infrastructure to now bringing in climate resilience and looking at and trying to better understand and prioritize the threats that are facing infrastructure from extreme weather and other climate-related effects, and seeing if we can build some solid defenses against those things. So that's my background. Okay, now in 2022, I begin every talk, independent of which one I'm going to ultimately focus on, by suggesting, more than suggesting, by claiming anyway, that these three categories go a long way to explain all the problems, all the challenges that we face, especially if you're like an operator of electric utility and or somebody with oversight on it in regulation, and any of the many and various stakeholders that care about these things, including consumers and users of electricity and power, etc. So I go around the ring like this, showing the interrelations. Climate physical, I touched on just a second ago, but we're talking about the heat, the freezes, the fires, the floods, the melting permafrost up north, the fact that the sea levels are rising, and that's worsening storm surge and flooding effects. I think I've hit most of them, but you get the idea. Those things are landing with increasing frequency and ferocity. That was frequency and ferocity on infrastructure and on communities. And we've got to harden ourselves against them if we're going to keep civilization going, keep the lights on, keep, let's say, crops growing. And so that's one of the principal drivers, in my opinion, of 2022. Because we're concerned the fact that the atmosphere is heating up and the ocean's heating up, and we have been for some time, not everybody, but a lot of decision makers have been, we have the energy transition. That term meaning attempting to encompass all of the various activities, policy and technology-wise, that have to do with us turning off more coal plants, turning off nuclear plants, reducing our amount of natural gas use and gasoline use, and trying to remake the energy and transportation sectors in one big push. And while that may sound like a noble idea, in practice, it's horrifically complicated. And while we make some good decisions, we make some mistakes along the way as we learn about the way if we deploy too many renewables, and shut down too much baseload power systems, we're operating on the edge of reliability. And we don't want to operate the grid that way, right? We don't want to see news headlines that say California is really close to blacking out this summer, and so is Texas. Or Texas froze last February in 2021, and hundreds of people died and tens of billions of dollars were lost. I don't want headlines like that. We want this to be the most critical, the most stable infrastructure that there is. So that's the energy transition. And whether you're directly involved in it or just somebody that suffers its effects, it's something to be aware of. And lastly, that brings me around the horn to cyber. Well, before we were aware of climate physical effects in the early 2000s, and before we really started calling this thing the energy transition, as I said, back with CIO Chris Smith, we were working on cyber as we understood that our dependency on computer systems, networks, applications, data, etc., was starting to put us in a vulnerable position, that those systems themselves were vulnerable to adversaries of various different kinds. So we've been working on it a while. The thing is, with the energy transition, we're introducing lots of new equipment, much of it made by manufacturers with really no background in cybersecurity at all. And so bringing awareness to them, bringing standards that they need to comply with if they're going to sell their wares to us, and the regulators, enhancing the regulators' abilities to govern over this extremely complex system in a way that raises the bar for cybersecurity for everybody involved. That's That's not an easy thing either. None of these things are easy, right? And the fact that they're interconnected and interrelated makes them, if anything, even more challenging. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to introduce a way or two before time expires that we can address them. Always make a point to say, if you're just trying to protect one thing, in this case, central to the graphic, the electric system, the grid, you have to remember that it doesn't work without reliable communications, without water treatment, wastewater treatment, without water management, dams, dikes, levees. And there's also a water component to generation, right, in hydropower. That's an issue when rivers start to dry up around the world, in the U.S. too, with the Colorado. Transportation is essential for getting products to places, getting people to work, and getting fuels to where they need to go. A lot of coal in our country travels down barges, and not just in the United States. And if those barges can't make it down the river because the water's too low, well, then that coal's going to move some other way, and that's by trucks. And it's so much less efficient and so much more expensive. More stuff for decision makers to keep in mind as they're trying to navigate these challenges. All right, now it's the time to dive in on the methodologies after that long wind-up pitch for context. So the book we published last year is called Countering Cyber Sabotage. It's about the CCE methodology, and I'm going to talk to you in a few slides about what that methodology entails. It first off begins with an idea that, keep running around your slides, apologize, that we need to think differently about the way we approach cybersecurity. For many years, folks thought we need to keep the adversary out. We'll build a wall, we'll build a perimeter, and we'll just make sure they can't get through there. Most often, the piece of cyber equipment would be that you would associate with that mindset would be a firewall, and close down all the ports that you can enter a network and enter a system through, except for the ones that are most essential, and we'll monitor those to see if any bad things come through. And that's how we'll keep people out and keep our operations safe and secure. But I have to tell you, many of my colleagues at INL, they come from backgrounds that weren't purely defensive in cyber operations. They know what it's like to look in from the outside at a company or a government organization, even one that thinks it's relatively well defended cybersecurity wise. And they report to me that there are just so many ways in. It's unbelievable. If somebody with some skill, some time, some resources wants to get into your systems, they will. It's not, it's not a question of if, it's when. I would say these days, it's not even when. I'd say in most cases, they're in. And you'll see a slide that attempts to articulate. And the ring around here is just all the different ways that someone can reach a system, including ways that you probably, or that at least many people don't think about. We went through a process with one of the standards groups, ISA IEC 62443. For those of you involved in cyber, that'll be a very familiar term. For those of you who aren't, you'll be like, well, that's just more gobbledygook. Nevertheless, it's a suite of security standards that apply to the product makers and the people that buy them and deploy the products, and methodology for how to protect organizations too. They have 4 different levels of security goodness or strength, as this slide shows, from 0 to 4. And up at the top, they're talking about the best adversaries, or the worst, depending on how you're looking at it, the ones that are most capable. And they've maintained that this CCE methodology, if you do it and do it right, and change your thinking along these lines, is a way to actually have a reasonably strong, reasonably good chance of defending against the best cyber adversaries. Most other approaches, tools or techniques, fall somewhat short of that. So just letting you know, this is a powerful capability. It's not easy to employ, and some of your colleagues have been trained in it. So we'll see, depending where you fit in the vast organization USDA, you may get exposed to this at some point in a rather direct way. The process has 4 phases, all the way from the very beginning, like I said in the first slide, right, of prioritizing by consequence. You can't protect everything. Identify and then protect what needs to be protected first and most. We do that I don't have time to go into detail on this, but we do that by identifying high consequence events, the highest consequence events, in conjunction with senior leadership and managers and engineers, other operators, depending on what systems you're talking about. And we identify what would be the worst day, what would be the worst thing that could happen to your organization, and then go after solving it. The second phase is mapping the whole technology, people, process, tech people process ecosystem that an adversary would first learn about, go to school on, master, and then leverage to navigate towards their end target. Phase 3 is where we bring in the cyber kill chain. That's where we have a person with targeting skills who's done this before and knows how to do it again. What type of choreography, what type of playbook would they put together, digitally speaking, to be able to reach the target with high confidence and then deliver a payload to it that would cause significant disruption or destruction. Back I said, the title of the book was Countering Cyber Sabotage. We are in the realm of cyber-enabled sabotage here when we're defending with CCE. And phase 4 is the thing that's a little bit different. Well, they're all a little different. There's echoes of other methodologies in there for sure. But phase 4 is relatively more unique than those in that it turns first to first principles engineering instead of another walk through the RSA cybersecurity exhibition hall to see the latest high-tech wizardry in digital defenses. This is more about using real engineering to make sure that even when the adversary, if and when they reach their target, that they simply can't create the catastrophic effect that they were seeking. And I'll describe that to you more in a subsequent slide, I think. We use in training and sometimes in presentations, we have case studies, scenarios, so that people can get a feel for how this would really work. And I remember in the early days asking my colleagues in the development and then the messaging and marketing around CCE, listen, I need a case study and I want it to be pretty heavy duty. So can you give me something in energy? Give me something military related, something with big economic consequences. And they told me they'd been asked that before for other things, and it always caused trouble. It always caused trouble inside the government when folks are like, you can't talk about that. So I said, all right, well, what can I do? What can we talk about? They went away for a day or two and came back and said, all right, you have a choice. It can either be cookies or cheese. I'm like, cookies or cheese? I didn't like that at first. I'm not even sure what my reasoning was at the time, but I ultimately went with cheese. And since then, cheese has been central to how we talk about CCE without getting into areas that are too sensitive. I mean, unless we're in a SCIF, unless we're in a place we can go into significant detail on matters of even great import than the dairy products. Some would argue cheese is quite central to many economies. In the United States, I can think of 3 states that think of themselves that way, and that's Vermont, back near where I used to live in Boston, and Wisconsin, where I live now, and Idaho, the lab that I'm part of. They all make huge contributions to the dairy economy, and cheese is one of the biggest parts of that. So we have this faux company, the Newhouse Cheese Company, and we talk about their CEO and their various C-level positions and others as we go through an attack on them that compromises their intellectual property, but also threatens their customer base and their reputation when industrial automated cheese making equipment is owned by a potential adversary and getting ready to do some very damaging, like making their customers sick. And that's the scenario, and we get to see how they argue about it. Down here, it shows that I presented this and did some training in Japan and the Indo-Pacific region using this case study. I mentioned before the old if. It's not if but when. Well, folks like Michael Hayden wouldn't even say that. He'd say they're going to get in, get over it. Just accept that they're in. And CCE begins with the assumption. This is another thing that's different about it. That they're already in. They're already mapping your systems. They're mapping your processes. They're beginning to understand your networks and what's most important to you in some ways better than you are. And that's what gives them an advantage until you get on the ball and make sure you know your stuff as well as they do, understand the way they would go about conducting their attack, and then deploy the phase 4 engineered mitigations against them to stop them before they get that far. This slide's talking about likelihood, right? I don't know if your organization does this, but many spend lots of time talking about, well, they try to figure out and use equations about whether someone's going to be having success against them or not. And I got to tell you, their confidence that they're right is extremely low. It just helps companies generate numbers that they can then factor into risk equations that they can then make spending decisions about. In CCE, we use the probability of 1 in the risk formulation of risk equals likelihood times impact. So once you take that out of the equation, then all you're dealing with is consequence or impact. And that's how we do it. This is what the adversary is thinking about, by the way, the best ones when they're coming at you. They're thinking about your critical functions. What are the things that you can't live without? When we're talking to a company, we say things to the CEO and the other seniors like, how would you kill your company? What would you go after to cause the worst things to happen? Not just for a couple hours, take you out of commission for a couple hours or a couple days, but basically to put you on your knees or worse for weeks or months. Things that would end your company. If we're talking to the military or other government missions, now we're talking about mission kills. You know, a military organization only exists to perform its mission. If it can't do that, there's really no reason for it to exist for taxpayers to spend money to support that capability. So performance of the mission reliably is number one. And that's because it's so important to us. That's the target. That informs the targeting decisions of the adversary. Critical functions and enabling functions that help the critical functions happen. Again, whether you're generating power or providing fuels or comms or water treatment or agriculture or dairy production or forest services, whatever organization you're in, you know that you have critical functions. You have critical functions, and we do everything we can to help defend them and help you defend them. Much of this is based on a concept, much of the theory that undergirds the formulation of CCE, and some of these other things I'm going to get to in a second, has to do with unverified trust. We can't help but live with it, but we want to have as little of it as possible. I think right up top, without going through all of them, I'll let your eyes wander across the slide a little bit. The slides will be available to you afterwards too, if I didn't say that. Think about as we turn to cloud providers to handle our applications and our data. And in the energy sector, they're actually trying to market the provision of monitoring services and maybe eventually control over operations via cloud avenues. Why would anyone do this? Because it's, from a marketing point of view, if you believe the marketing, and I think you can often, it's cheaper. There's higher uptime than running your own IT operations, and they're going to say there's more security, and depending on what your capabilities are, they might be right. There's just a number of good reasons why so much is moving to the cloud. The issue is when we sign those contracts for service level agreements and accept the safety and security language, we are putting our trust in them. And it's really, really, really hard for a client to understand just how on the ball that cloud service provider and their data centers are. And if they're at a certain level of proficiency at one moment, will they maintain that over time? And how will we know? How can we peek into that? Almost all of these categories on this slide are like that, and we live with them. And in the case of CCE, we're trying to make sure that no matter what the answers to these things are, that we've provided a viable means of defense when the adversary exploits these different pathways of unverified trust. All right, I'm going to come out of CCE now and say there is a sibling, I'm not sure if it's a sibling or a parent, but a methodology called cyber-informed engineering, little more simplified, right, CIE, and that recently it was signed in by the Secretary of Energy as a national strategy. And that means that we're taking it to universities across the country and internationally. We're going into STEM programs. We're going into engineering companies and trying to inculcate these concepts, many of them CCE related, but I'll show you a slide with some difference, so that all the products and the services that we end up using are made and delivered by people who are much more cognizant, much more fully cognizant of the cyber landscape that everything operates in these days, and are able to provide us with safer operating conditions. So this slide shows you one way of saying the difference between CCE and CIE is that CCE thinks about an organization. How do we make an organization be able to perform its mission with more security, more confidence, right? More reliability. CIE is more about, and I don't know if all my colleagues agree with this, my characterization of it, but it's more about a thing, a product, a system. And from cradle to grave, from the very first napkin sketch in the concept development phase, napkin sketch or something built in a garage, it's an idea. I get them sometimes walking the dog. From that moment on, going around down counterclockwise, down up again, as that thing transitions from just being an idea to being an engineered design that has architecture and software and hardware, and then integrated with what it needs to be integrated, T&E, and ultimately it's out in the field. It transitions into O&M. That's what we're thinking about with CIE and making that just a universal concept. And so far, it's off to a good start. If you look at the bracket on the right-hand side, though, that's where today, OT, operational technology, industrial control systems, cyber physical, those are all roughly synonymous. That's where those concepts come to bear. Which I think we're trying to say, it's late. It's really late in the game. And if you did it earlier, if you thought about those things earlier throughout the whole process, you'd have an inherently more secure system, and it would just be a lot easier and in a lot of ways less expensive than trying to bolt on. You've heard of bolt-on cybersecurity versus bake-in. This is bolt-on, this is bake-in, where from the very beginning you're aware that that product, that thing, that system is going to live in a cyber-contested space, and you want it to be as rock solid as possible when it gets out into the field. And it's going to be that way, if you're thinking that way, all the way through these different processes. That's CIE. In the document that I showed you, there it is again in the top middle, that was published introducing CIE to the world as a national strategy, we have 5 pillars. And those go from awareness, education, development, that's the building out of the capabilities that we will describe in awareness and education phases. And then we're going to bring that, and we're already starting, these are all happening at the same time to a certain extent, we'll bring that to folks that are operating built infrastructure already, you can call it legacy if you want to, and see if there's ways that they can enhance the cybersecurity of that built infrastructure as other systems are integrated or layered on with it. And then really the biggest opportunity, I think, is future infrastructure. That's where the thing hasn't been designed yet. And we have a fresh start, and we can go through the full CIE process with the engineers, with the customers, with the other partners and supply chain folks, and make sure that when that thing finally is ready for operational use, that it is as safe and secure as possible. So that's my charge now for the rest of this year, and probably for the next year or two, will be to bring CIE to the world. Now, I said there'd be a couple more things besides CCE and CIE, and this is the first of the two. This one's called Citrix, and it's basically, let's see, what's the metaphor I can use for this? First of all, at the bottom, you can see there's a bunch of really powerful national lab brains working on this capability. It's been in existence in some form or fashion for almost 2 decades. Maybe I can say 2 decades. And it's essentially taking a piece of equipment, it could be grid equipment, could be something else that's used in very important places. And there could be some USDA versions of this. And doing a biopsy on it, opening it up in our labs with people that are trained in this, with very specific tools, very special tools, and going deep on all the hardware, the software, the firmware, looking at the supply chains, looking at the provenance of the software. Where did it come from? Who made it? What do we know about it? What kind of known vulnerabilities are in these systems? Are there other things in there that haven't yet been discovered and publicized that we find, because our guys are good at this, that we then can share back out with the folks that are the end users of these systems, the folks that make them, so that they can make their next version better, and with certain parts of the federal government, so they can have a better awareness of what the risks are in some of these most important pieces of equipment. That's Citrix. I said it's like a biopsy for really important critical equipment. Sometimes the biopsies, and I guess it's an autopsy because we can't use the thing again. We try not to kill it, but sometimes that happens as part of the process. Anyway, that's Citrix. Second one I wanted to mention to you is pronounced, putting myself over here, Cymani. And this is an institute. It's headquartered in Texas at San Antonio, UTSA, but we've got a bunch of other universities coming on board, partners in industry, big engineering firms, both the ones that make energy and other infrastructure products, as well as those that integrate them. And we're trying to, you may sense, we're bringing CIE to the manufacturing community, because in that ecosystem, we touch all the different pieces and parts and players that are involved. And you can learn about both of these things, Citrix and Cymani. I don't think I put the links down here, but they're both very Googleable, and you can go as deep as you want. And I have contact information on the last slide, so if you want to do some follow-up questions with me, or introducing you to any of my colleagues that are deep on these things, I'd be more than glad to do that. And that's it. This is my new home city of the last 4 years, Milwaukee in the upper Midwest. It's a manufacturing hub itself, going all the way back to the early days of, you guessed it, beer. But so much has sprung from that those origins. It's a great place to live, I've come to find, being an East Coaster by history. Anyway, I'll sign off here. I hope you found some of this material useful for you. You can reach me at that email address, or see some of the things that I say that are related in cyber and climate matters at that Twitter account. And I hope you have a good rest of the conference and success. And that's all I'll say for now. Thanks for your time and attention. Be safe out there. Bye-bye.